Laura, it's so great to see you. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. I've been super enjoying your book, Unshrunk. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay, and I'm really glad to be here.
I am so glad for your work. I'm so glad that people are finally talking about this and questioning. I suppose I don't want to speak on your half, but I think psychiatry in general, and certainly the so-called medical treatments for people with psychiatric disorders. But I want to start with your story, which in your book you start at teenagerhood. What was going on for you as a teenager?
Well, I'd always been a very intense, sensitive girl who I just felt the world in big ways. And so that in combination with my kind of with I guess you could say that my upbringing and the town I grew up in, which was there was a lot of people with socioeconomic means. There was a lot of, I went to private school, a lot of material resources, a lot of very driven, overachieving people. So I kind of fit right into that. Had perfectionistic tendencies, was kind of oriented around pleasing people, pleasing the adults around me. So the combination of those different traits, you could say, left me at age 13, or kind of, you could say, forced me up at age 13 against this like really painful realization that I didn't know who I was, that I just was kind of performing this life and doing well on paper, quote unquote, but who was I actually, and what did I care about, and what power did I actually have over my life? And I realized I didn't really have any. So that was kind of the state of mind I was in when I not too long after was sent to my first therapist, because I couldn't keep these realizations compartmentalized in me for too long, because it was just too much to bear, that I was stuck in this life, this performative life. So I began acting out, cutting myself, just trying to seek relief, trying to feel like I had some semblance of control over myself. And of course, my parents didn't know what to do with that, and sent me to a professional by age 13.
Do you think that what you were experiencing was pretty common to what other girls your age were experiencing, or do you think there was something different happening for you?
I think that experience is very common. Maybe the intensity of what I was going through was a bit less common, maybe not. But I think the problem was that I didn't see anyone else or hear anyone else talking about these kinds of things. So I had no idea that this was like totally typical adolescence and waking up and questioning power and authority. So it felt like I was completely unique, which was part of why I got so terrified of myself, really, because I thought I was the only one.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a teenager, I remember feeling sort of like I was performing also, not in the same way as you. I didn't really care about achieving in school, and I very much underachieved in school.
Good for you.
I tried to go as little as possible. And instead spent my time like writing poetry in cafes and smoking cigarettes.
Wow. Courageous. I love it.
But you're like, you don't know where you fit in. You're trying to find your identity, you feel super insecure about everything, or I did in any case. You feel like obviously your parents don't understand you at all. And, this is common probably to everyone in puberty, but there's probably something particular to being a girl, where we're experiencing all these things, particularly as it comes to this. I didn't experience this personally, but I know lots of other girls who did things like cutting and eating disorders and those kinds of things. The experience of having sex with boys for the first time, which I don't know if it's too much of a generalization to say that it's not like super pleasant when you're a teenager. So how did those things sort of factor into your experiences and then your sort of understanding of your mental illness?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, and I do think this is where I think it is what I went through is quite universal. I mean, I think as girls, we do have these added layers on us around, maybe a better way to put it is the boxes that we grow up inside feel tighter and more confining, perhaps, than boys. And I think when I started to feel that and see that, the only thing that this wasn't a conscious process, but I see now this is exactly what I was doing. The only thing that I could exert control over to try to feel like I had some power here was on my body. So, whether it was causing deliberate pain through self-injury or, trying to control my body through how I, what I ate or didn't eat and how I exercised or didn't exercise. I think a lot of us as girls and young women end up kind of playing out all the ways that we feel, under the control or under the thumb of forces around us. We can play that out on ourselves instead, which is totally what happened. And I think to tie in the kind of psychiatric diagnosis piece here, what did eventually happen for me, and I think happens also to a lot of girls and women, is that those kinds of behaviors that so many of us turn to try to feel secure and in control and like we have some semblance of power end up looking to mental health professionals like so-called symptoms of, various mental illness diagnoses, especially borderline personality disorder, which is one of the labels that eventually got slapped on me. And I didn't even know that for a while. They didn't even tell me. But
So what happened when you got to the psychiatrist? What were you told?
So when I was after that first therapist that I was sent to kind of tried to help me for a while and it wasn't really working.
Wait, sorry, was it a therapist or a psychiatrist? I don't remember.
I was first sent to a therapist.
Okay.
And then this therapist told my parents that I needed more help. So she recommended a psychiatrist. So I ended up getting sent to my first psychiatrist. By then I was 14. And at home I was acting out, screaming, yelling, kind of getting physical with my mother, terrifying my sisters, really in great despair and again, cutting myself and all of these things. So those behaviors and emotions within the first session with this stranger I'd never met before, the psychiatrist, those were all translated through her kind of like, clinical gaze into symptoms of bipolar disorder. And this was the mid-90s. And what was happening around me at that time was a very concerted and well-funded effort by a few powerful psychiatrists affiliated with Harvard Medical School to kind of expand market share for their treatments into children. And prior to the mid-90s, the idea of kids having so-called bipolar disorder was basically unheard of. And then these few psychiatrists started writing papers saying that actually a lot of children have bipolar disorder. We just haven't been recognizing it because mania in kids looks different than in adults. And in kids, it looks like anger and irritability and, kind of emotional lability and, of course, all the things that I, as this pubescent girl, was experiencing, which is why I got that label like very quickly. And I think there was quite a boom in diagnosing. I can't remember the numbers. It was astronomical, increase through the 90s into the early 2000s of kids getting this diagnosis. So it was like perfect timing for me. And I knew then as a 14-year-old girl that this was bullshit, that there was Nothing wrong with me, that my anger and my despair were actually important, like meaningful responses to the environment that I was in. But I couldn't articulate that to these adults around me, let alone really to myself. I just like sensed it. And so even though I tried to resist and tell myself like, she's wrong, this isn't true. And when she put me right on a mood stabilizer and an antidepressant, I'd like tried not to take them and I'd hide the pills and throw them out. Eventually, a few years in, I gave in and bought into the whole thing. Yeah.
So what were you diagnosed with?
The first diagnosis was bipolar disorder at age 14. And I was told within this first session, literally, this stranger I had never met before sat in front of me for 50 minutes and then said, you have an incurable illness that you'll have for the rest of your life, but you can manage it. I mean, and you know, it sounds ridiculous. And so many people upon reading my book will be like, did that really happen? They can't fathom that a doctor would say that to a kid. I'm like, this is the story that psychiatry tells patients. We are told that these so-called illnesses are incurable. You can manage them, but you can't ever be free of them.
I mean, I can fathom it because I feel like it's happening even more now with, every single person I know apparently having ADHD.
Yeah.
And like so many parents being like, oh, my kid has ADHD. And I'm like, or, all these people to me sound like me. So I guess I have ADHD too. I just don't choose to label myself as having some kind of like mental illness that needs treatment because I'm not very good at focusing or I'm late all the time. But yeah, I mean, I wonder why more people don't question this stuff. We talk all the time about a mental health crisis in America, for example. This many people, this many kids are depressed, this many people or kids have anxiety, this many people have ADHD, and I often wonder if it's that there's a mental health crisis or it's just that people are getting diagnosed and prescribed these pills in much, 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 much higher numbers than ever before. I'm curious to know, what did they tell you that bipolar disorder was?
That, this basically that there was something wrong with my brain, and, that it was, of course, I can't remember if it was in that first appointment with that psychiatrist, but, not long after, this idea of a chemical imbalance, it's just, you're just the unlucky, person who happened to have some flaws in your biochemistry. It's not your fault. You're not a bad person. You're a sick person. and that story has embedded itself so deeply in our culture, really beginning in the 90s. I mean, Prozac came out in the late 80s, and the 90s was, declared the decade of the brain by the US government, and drug companies began funding kind of, what they called mental health awareness campaigns. Of course, to this day, like right now, we're in Mental Health Awareness Month, the month of May. The 90s began what today is this ubiquitous language of, kind of medicalization that we use to make sense of our minds, our emotions, our behaviors. And people don't even realize that it's a story. They just kind of take for granted, because it sounds medical, that it must be this objective truth. And I took it for granted for nearly a decade and a half. And I think, to your point, we are in what many people call a mental health crisis. But I do think a big component of this crisis that we're in is actually a crisis largely induced by medicalization of our suffering, which there is a lot of. I do think there is more suffering than, I don't know, ever before, but certainly in the past 20 years. And and the the pharmaceuticalization of help, basically. I think those two factors have actually led to more struggles. People to feel increasingly more disabled and despairing and hopeless, because that story of incurable brain diseases is like, I mean, talk about a hopeless story, and talk about a story that ends up teaching you to give up your sense of agency over yourself and your behaviors and your emotions, because it's not your fault. And there's nothing you can do about it. So yeah, we are in a huge crisis right now. And I do think there are very real reasons why people are suffering. I mean, look at the last 5 years. The fact that rates of suicidal feelings, rates of stimulant use, rates of anti-anxiety use, have just shot up. It's not a coincidence that this has happened in the last 5 years. And yet people are being told it's because there's something wrong with their brain, as opposed to something wrong with what just happened in our world over the last 5 years. So, yeah.
Yeah. And probably I would assume that a lot of this is connected to that. I mean, in some ways, what you said earlier about like a lack of agency. So you have this problem. There's nothing you can do about it. All you can do is medicate. And in reality, there are lots of things that you can do if you're struggling with things like depression and anxiety, for example. And there are things that are, pretty, I mean, maybe not easy, but I mean, certainly more accessible, and they're healthier solutions. Like things like, people always think that I'm being glib, but it's like, go to the gym. Like it really helps a lot, like get some sun, get exercise, change your diet. And maybe you do need to change your lifestyle. Maybe you do need to change your job. Maybe you do need to change your relationships, but there's ways that you can change your life to feel better, but they're in some ways harder and more long-term solutions. Obviously, popping a pill seems like an easier solution, but it's not fixing the problem. And it's, again, you have to accept this idea that you're sick and incurable for your whole life.
And what's wild, Megan? Like, had you 16 years ago said, you know what, Laura, like you eating all this fake sugar and nasty fat-free shit, and have you thought about reading up on the effects those might be having on you? Have you thought about getting outside? I would have been offended. I would have been insulted. Like, how dare you suggest that I just need to make some lifestyle tweaks? Like, do you not understand that my brain is diseased? And that's the insidiousness of the medical model, is that because it's taken on kind of a monolithic status in our cultural like meaning making around suffering, and young people especially almost feel, speaking for myself, and I think I see it a lot in the culture, it's the only way to feel validated in your pain is to medicalize it. And if you dare suggest it's just being human, that's an insult. And of course, having bought into that through the most formative years of my life, my teens and 20s, and then eventually waking up and leaving it all behind, in retrospect, I see that actually it was the most invalidating thing that I could do to my suffering, was, to reduce it to a list of symptoms of a so-called illness. Like I was having real intense pain in mind, body, and spirit. And those were actually like really meaningful responses to what was happening in my life. And that's the tragedy, I think, in the medical model, is that it strips suffering of context, and it implies that the only way pain is taken seriously is through reducing it to medical language.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's interesting to think about, because, there's so many ways that we can learn to cope with things. I mean, we all struggle with things like feeling sad or feeling depressed or feeling anxious sometimes. I mean, they're usually related to things that are happening in your life, and there's ways to cope with that. And by the same token, it's not always bad to kind of lean into those feelings and just accept that, okay, I'm feeling bad right now for a reason. I'm going to just like sit with this, and it's okay. And it's actually not the end of the world. And I'm not going to feel like this way forever. And it's not going to kill me. And I think that as a society, we've taken the opposite approach.
Yeah, I totally agree. Both, I think through this medicalized story of, incurable brain disease bullshit. And then also I think through the rise of the therapy industry and, growing up in therapy, basically once a week, eventually twice a week, every single week of my life through my teens and 20s, you end up, the more that therapeutic encounter becomes your go-to source of support, which I do think can happen. It can happen more easily than you even realize, where you just come to rely on this professional sitting in front of you to pour out your pain and receive it. It does. I think for a lot of people, there can be this reinforcing feedback loop where you just like need to be in pain so that you can feel seen and validated, and you just kind of bring this endless supply of problems in yourself that you're calling problems and that you're focusing on and prioritizing. For me, I ended up not only becoming just terrified of my pain, because I was thinking of it as this disease that was progressing and getting worse, but I also became just completely self-absorbed about it and just like totally focused on myself all the time. How I felt was like more important than anything else. And that I think is we're seeing that play out in the culture at large. I think in a lot of these like polarized issues that people get so heated about, I can't help but wonder if the therapeuticization of, of the kind of younger millennials and Gen Z is, a big part of why that's happening.
Yeah. Do you think that therapy is ever helpful? I mean, I think I've been like a long time proponent of therapy. And I know that as a woman who was like heavily involved in feminism for most of my life, like from teenagerhood, I did honestly sort of have this approach to men and my boyfriends, for example, where I'm like, you all need to go to therapy. And I don't necessarily feel that way anymore. And I feel like there's other things that are lacking in our lives that if we added back in would probably be a lot more helpful and useful in terms of us feeling good about our lives and feeling fulfilled and things like that. And, probably accepting that men and women are different and so and so forth. But I mean, do you think that I don't expect you to say, oh, all therapy is bad, but do you think that we've sort of overemphasized therapy as a solution to our woes and our problems in our culture?
I think we have. I think it's a symptom, not to medicalize it, but the fact that therapy is so predominant, I think, speaks to the lack of other spaces that we see before us to kind of turn to for comfort, for guidance, for support. Spaces that, Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone many years ago, and of looking at this over the, in the last century, half century to century, just the increasing loss of spaces in our local communities where people can connect with one another. I think, whether the rise of the therapy industry is a result of that, or is maybe even fueling the demise of non-clinical, non-professional spaces where people can support one another, I'm not sure. But I do think you're right that it has, I think a lot of people view therapy as like the only real reliable place you can turn for help. And I do think therapy can be really helpful. I mean, I might be a bit cynical here, but I think it speaks more to the individual therapist than to any kind of, oh, this therapeutic modality is amazing. I really think it's about the human being who is in this therapist role. And if there's someone who's connected to their heart, who's connected to a sense of humility, openness, curiosity, tolerance of risk and uncertainty, then they might be, an incredible therapist. I think it's also about, like, is the therapist's objective to make him or herself obsolete to the client or not? And I happen to be in front of therapists who fell in the or not category. And I just, like, it was my baseline operating assumption. Like, I'm going to be in therapy for the rest of my life because I have all these problems and I'm going to need a place. Like, I'm never going to not be mentally ill. And my therapist didn't really ever challenge that baseline operating assumption, which I think is part of why it was just so unhelpful for me in particular.
Yeah, I mean, they want to keep their job.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there is such a thing as bipolar disorder?
I think that people lose their shit, stop sleeping, spin out, have delusions, get paranoid, act totally wacky. And I think people, of course, plummet into the depths of sometimes suicidal despair. I think all of those things are real and sometimes, like, profoundly disabling and scary and significant. But just based on the scientific information that we have available, I don't believe that there's this discrete illness called bipolar disorder that is this locatable, pathology inside a person's brain that causes all those things to happen. I think those real experiences are a response to the person's life circumstances, what the person is putting in his or her body, what's happened to that person. Sometimes, like, there can be a physical cause, like a hormonal issue, thyroid issue. But this idea of bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or depression or ADHD being these discrete disease entities, we don't have a solid evidence base for that. And so for that reason, I don't kind of think of them as real so-called, conditions. I think of them more as these subjective descriptors that have no scientific basis. And so for that reason, they're just not useful, all these diagnoses, for me to use on myself or for people in my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think back to some of the people who I decided had bipolar disorder or whatever, maybe they thought they did, it's actually that they were taking all sorts of pills, like prescription pills, and not sleeping and not eating properly, and totally kind of losing their minds and acting crazy, which makes a lot of sense if you're taking pills that are essentially like speed. Yep. And then you can't sleep and then you lose your appetite. It makes a lot of sense that you kind of lose your mind a bit.
Yep. I mean, sleep deprivation is used as a form of torture. It will make any human being go crazy. Yeah. And people often are shocked when they hear me say, schizophrenia is just this subjective label. They're like, what do you mean? Because they're picturing, like, that person they know who's, floridly psychotic or whatever you want to call it. And I have almost never, and many friends of mine have been given that label in their lives. And I have almost never met someone who has been given a diagnosis of schizophrenia or some other psychotic disorder who didn't first have profound sleep deprivation before they lost their shit. And so, just one simple practical tweak that the mental health industry could consider making is, instead of just slapping this really potent label on someone right away, like out the gates when they're acting crazy, like, why don't you help them get some sleep and then let their bodies settle down for a little while and then and then get back to your diagnoses? Like, give them a chance here. Come on, people.
Yeah. Do you think that anyone needs psychiatric drugs? I mean, do you think that any of these drugs that are prescribed to treat these various mental illnesses are helpful, or do you think that we should just be done with that entirely?
I think psych drugs can be helpful for many people, especially in the short term, just not for the reasons we've been told they are. You know, if I, for so many years I was told, you have this condition called bipolar disorder. This antidepressant we have you on is going to target your depressive symptoms. The mood stabilizer is going to help keep your moods level. The antipsychotic is going to suppress your hypomanic tendencies, blah, blah, blah. That was all marketing language. None of that was actually objectively true. These drugs that I was on were all psychoactive chemicals that were working, so to speak, by disrupting normal brain chemistry. And just like someone who gets anxious before they go to a social gathering might feel helped having a glass of wine, someone taking a Valium for a panic attack, or someone who is just so overwhelmed by the rawness of their despair that they feel kind of dampened down a bit by their so-called antidepressant. I think that can be really helpful, at least for a little while. I don't think we have a strong evidence base for long-term use of these drugs. They're approved on the basis of very short-term trials that last on average 6 to 8 weeks. So I'm not anti-medication. I'm about informed choice. And that starts to me with the language we use to talk about these drugs. Like if we're talking about them as medications treating illnesses, that's not an informed choice. If we're talking about them as drugs that are altering your central nervous system function and that in a way that might feel helpful to you, then I'm like, okay, that's a good starting point. And then, from there, just get informed about the risks, get informed about alternatives, and then make your own decision. That's kind of my view on all of it.
I mean, can we talk about informed choice if we're talking about kids, like about teenagers?
I'm against drugging of children. That's my view on it. But I also recognize the bind that many parents are in. That's not a justification for putting kids on drugs, but parents are, gosh, the number of horror stories I've heard from parents who's, where the schools were calling them and pressuring them and basically saying your kid can't come back until they're on a stimulant, or parents who are struggling to hold down 2 jobs and they just don't have the bandwidth to help their kid navigate this crisis. Like, I feel for parents who feel they have no choice but to start their kids on these drugs. I think it's a giant experiment, the consequences of which I know from firsthand experience, having been put on these drugs as a kid. And I feel quite strongly against it. But I also think we need to help parents have more options, have more support, have better information so that they can actually make better choices.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely unfair to tell parents that your kid has ADHD and they can't come back to class unless they go on these pills. And I'm totally grossed out at the fact that schools are even encouraging these diagnoses and so-called treatments. Is just not their place.
Yeah, the creep of so-called mental health into schools, into workplaces. I mean, it really has come to infuse almost every nook and cranny of day-to-day life. And I think in school settings, it's of course totally about helping the adults, have an easier time. Is like the teacher who's pressuring parents to start their kids on stimulants. This has nothing to do with the kid and everything to do with the teacher being annoyed and drained and not able to handle the kid. And so, but as you said, if the real problem is the circumstances and, having to change the circumstances when it comes to the entire education industry, like, that's a big ask. Of course, I think it should happen. I do think modern schooling is an abomination in so many ways, but I'm not optimistic that schools are going to be like, you're totally right. Like, let's completely restructure how we run and like, let's lose a lot of money actually meeting kids' needs, like what they really actually need. They're not going to do that.
Yeah. So what would have been helpful to you as a teenager when you were going through all this?
I think had I seen other girls, because I went to this private all-girls school, so had I seen other girls around me talking about struggles, talking about how confused they felt about who they were and how they fit into the world, talking about the anger they felt at all the pressure on their shoulders. Had I seen these conversations happening, I think I would have tapped into courage that I think I ended up not being able to tap into because I was so convinced that I was completely alone. I think also my parents, had they, and I don't blame them for any of the decisions they made. They were doing the best they could with, what they had. But I think we grew up, just like the climate of the town I grew up in, and just the kind of the cultural values in this like super wealthy, waspy town that I grew up in. Parents weren't always as in touch with the full spectrum of emotions as maybe they otherwise could have been, because there was just so much emphasis on appearance and like appearing like you had it all together. So I don't know. I think had my parents in our family system been able to have more open conversations about challenges and struggles and confusion and pain, that might have helped too. But yeah, I mean, I look back on how it played out and I'm like, it couldn't have gone another way given the reality of the time and the circumstances that I was in. But I think when parents today reach out to me because their daughter or their son is in a similar situation, what I'll say to them is, like start with, first of all, just trusting in your own parental instincts. Don't let any professionals or authority figures like gaslight you into distrusting your instincts as a parent. But also tap into a sense of faith and trust in your kid, and that there's a wisdom to what they're struggling with that you might not understand. They probably don't understand it either. There's a reason why they're feeling this way or acting this way. And if you can stay curious and courageous and just like tolerate how overwhelming and confusing and scary this feels right now, and focus on learning about, options, resources, that aren't necessarily in the mental health system. Like maybe they're in the spiritual realm, maybe they're in the political realm, like maybe they're in the nutrition realm. Just be open and curious and try to stay connected to a sense of trust that your kid is in a process that is one chapter of their life. Like that to me is the message that I try to share with parents who are just like freaking the fuck out because their kid's like slicing up her arm or talking about death or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So what was it how did you finally come out of this? How did you come to get off these drugs and start to see these diagnoses differently?
So between the ages of 18 and 27, which was, 18 was when I eventually really bought into this idea that I was sick. My life began to really fall progressively more apart. And it was in the same time period that I became this very compliant psychiatric patient who, did as my doctors said, took my meds as prescribed, went to therapy every week. Eventually, when things started to get really bad, I would check myself into hospitals, programs. Like I just was this dutiful, very faithful psych patient, and believing, one day eventually I'll feel better. I'll feel okay. I'll feel like I have some peace of mind or something. And I just never got it, but didn't lose faith in the idea that I would eventually if I just kept doing what they were telling me to do. And so eventually things got so bad and I got so dysfunctional and just like totally incapacitated that I was told that my illness had become treatment resistant. Basically, like I was just so sick that all these great treatments like couldn't help. which was a devastating message to receive because, of course, I had put all my faith in these treatments. And I go into all of this in the book, how that eventually led me to try to kill myself because I just saw no hope. And it took another couple of years before I, to get to your question, like had what I think of as like an awakening, an aha moment. And I had a few experiences, and I go into them in Unshrunk, where I came up against the power that the mental health industry has to strip you of your basic rights, to force you into the hospital, to force you to take a drug you don't want to take. Um, I had always intellectually known that psychiatrists had the power to do this. I'd seen it happen when I was locked up on psych wards to other people, but when it happened to me, that was what dislodged my faith and got me questioning, like, what the fuck is this system I've been like completely deferential to? Like, how have I given it all this power over me? Like, I did this, I gave this power to them. And I eventually began questioning also my relationship to these meds, because I realized like my entire adult life I had been medicated. Who would I be off of these drugs? I couldn't stop asking that question. And it was in that state of mind where I was just wondering and questioning and like uneasy, very uneasy about my relationship to the mental health industry, that I found a book by a medical journalist that basically makes a compelling case that if you look at the evidence base for long-term psychiatric drug use, on the whole, it's making us sicker, like more disabled in mind, body, and spirit. And that was my aha moment, because it all clicked. And I was like, holy shit, what if it hasn't been treatment-resistant mental illness? What if it's been the treatment? And then that was back in 2010, I was 27. And that began my journey away from all of it. And I just, for your audience, like want to make really clear that when you've taken psychiatric drugs for any length of time, your central nervous system can become dependent on them without you even realizing it. We're not told this before we start these drugs. We have no idea. Most people have no idea that this is even possible. And yet, with the well over 65 million of us on these drugs, this is just a stark reality for many, many people. And because your body becomes dependent on these drugs, when you try to stop them, all hell can break loose. And we get told, oh, you're having a relapse. This is why you need your meds. Like, you don't want to feel like this, right? Like, this doesn't make sense for you to stay off. You want to feel better. That what's actually happening is your body's in withdrawal. And none of us are being told this. So when I woke up and realized these drugs had been harming me, I decided, I need to get off these drugs as fast as I possibly can, not knowing any of this. And I went through a brutal experience of withdrawal that took really like years to recover from. And I always say, like, I happened, because of my socioeconomic background, like I happened to be able to survive it because my family took care of me. I couldn't take care of myself. I think a lot of people stay on psych drugs for the long term because every time they try to stop, they feel horrible, and they don't realize it's not them, it's withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's so frustrating and really sad to hear all this, but I'm so glad that you're talking about all this. And yeah, your book was wonderful. I mean, not just in terms of what it conveys, but it was it's an enjoyable read. It's well written. So congratulations.
Thanks. It's a real honor coming from you. I appreciate it a lot. I mean, I knew when I got off the drugs, I knew I had to make sense of like what the fuck had just happened the previous 14 years, because everything I thought I believed, was true, was suddenly blown up. And I was just completely overwhelmed and confused and angry and sad and in grief. And I knew I have to write I have to write about this. I have to make sense of what has happened to me. And I think for anyone out there who is, struggling, whether you're on psych drugs, you're trying to get off psych drugs, you've never even taken psych drugs, the desperation for relief can kind of trick us into thinking that this pain is this like meaningless, useless thing that's like destroying our lives or wasting our time, or that you can't really live until you're free of your pain. And what I've realized in going through this is it's the purpose of being here is not the absence of pain. It's about utilizing the pain that we're faced with, which is inevitable, and trying to turn it into something that can help others or help the world, make the world a better place, contest unjust, corrupt power, whatever it is. Like, our pain is, to me, like this really important fuel that we need to use to propel personal and societal change. And the medical model prevents us from doing that. It kind of makes people who are actually canaries in the coal mine feel convinced that they're the problems, not the mine that they're in. And yeah, but I feel things changing, and I hope my book can help spark a conversation about it and fuel the conversation about it, because more people are on these drugs than ever before, just convinced that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, the fact that feeling pain and feeling sadness is also what allows us to feel good and happy and to appreciate the beauty and miracle of life.
Here.
Okay, so for those watching and listening, your book again is Unshrunk, and tell us where we can find it, buy it, read it, follow you online.
Well, you can find my book at unshrunkthebook.com or at my website, lauradelano.com. You can buy it at all fine booksellers. I'm on X and Facebook and Instagram. All those links you can get on my website. And I hope to hear from anyone out there who reads my book and has opinions on it, good, bad, or ugly. I want to hear it all.
Awesome. Okay, well, thanks again for your time. It was so great to talk with you.
Thanks for having me, Megan. It's great to be here.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.